Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We were all traumatized by the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001, but they were 13 years ago. Now, in 2014, almost 2015, our forces are still in Afghanistan and we're at war again in Iraq. No one even talks about peace anymore. Is this seemingly perpetual warfare our new normal? We'll talk about this and much more with my guest, Thomas McDonnell, a professor of international law at the Pace University School of Law here in New York. Professor McDonnell, welcome.
Thank you.
Appreciate having you today. There's a lot to cover. We'll get to as much as we can. You know, we've gone back into Iraq to fight this terror group, the Islamic State, ISIL, or ISIS as people call it. Talk about the rise of this group. It didn't even exist when we invaded Iraq in 2003. Talk about some of the circumstances that led to its creation.
All right. Well, I think we have to talk about the immediate causes and then the historical causes of the rise of this group and terrorism, Islamic terrorism generally. The immediate cause was our invasion of 2003. Okay? The Bush-Cheney invasion of that country overthrew Saddam Hussein, admittedly one of the most brutal dictators to walk the planet in the last 100 years. But it also threw out the Sunnis from power in that country. They had governed that country since its inception by Great Britain, taking it on essentially as a colony after World War I. So by throwing out Saddam Hussein, that had created a backlash, even though the Sunnis were a minority and are still a minority in that country. When you run a country for over 70 years, you kind of get used to the idea of being in control. So all of a sudden, the Sunnis who were once in power are out of power. The other aspect of this is the disastrous de-Baathification program that the Bush-Cheney administration implemented. What they essentially did was take the Saddam Hussein's army, and that was largely a Sunni military force, and they essentially fired the entire force.
This was an experienced war-fighting army.
Exactly, but they were fired, and they went over to the opposition, if you will, became part of a civil war against the now Shia-forming government.
The insurgency that we talk about, they were a big part of that insurgency.
And they are today.
Yeah.
Okay, so they are a big part of ISIS today. Now, it certainly is unfortunate that we could not have kept more troops when we pulled them out at the end of 2011. But to me, that's somewhat secondary to what we did in essentially invading Iraq. The second important immediate cause is Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. Okay? He engaged in really a Machiavellian course of action. He essentially gunned down peaceful protesters from the Arab Spring, wanting a peaceful revolution in that country. He then pushed the country into civil war. After that, he bombed the Free Syrian Army and other opposing groups, but left ISIS greatly untouched. He was trying to create a dilemma. It's either me or ISIS.
Causing a split in the insurgents in Syria, so that the insurgents will be fighting against one another in addition to fighting against
Exactly. So what we have are these forces that have kind of come together that have caused this. I think it's important, though, for your viewers to also kind of understand the overall history of the situation, because these were the immediate causes. But the history of the rise of Islamic terrorism, which is something that I think is rarely discussed, needs to be addressed. Okay? And it is complex, but I'll try to break it down into three parts. One is Western colonization of Muslim countries, and I should say add Russian colonization of Muslim countries. The second is something that is directly relevant to the rise of ISIS, and that is the secularization regime, aggressive secularization which was carried out by Turkey's Ataturk after World War I. Okay? And lastly, the rise of secular authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And the reason why this is important for us is that we supported those secular authoritarian regimes. We supported initially Saddam Hussein. We supported the Shah of Iran. Okay? We supported, and we still support, the repressive House of Saud. We support the autocratic tiny Gulf oil states. So this coming together allowed the Islamic terrorists to arise.
They could make the case to ordinary people in these countries that we were on the side of and giving essential support to these tyrants, the murderous tyrants.
Precisely. And I just want to talk a little bit more about Ataturk. The thing is, if you may recall, I remember when I was in 10th grade reading the civics books, okay, and how we really praised Ataturk for all that he did to modernize Turkey. But what was left out of that discussion was the fact that this was an extraordinarily aggressive move on his part. Okay? He abolished the caliphate. Now, the caliph was once the head of the Ottoman Empire as well as the religious head. But abolishing the caliphate for Muslims was kind of like abolishing the papacy, the office of the Pope, for Catholics. It caused dismay in the entire Muslim world. And this is the connection to ISIS today. The abolishment by Turkey okay, was seen by more conservative Muslims as a real assault upon them. Okay? And also it was seen in a sense as taking on the mantle of the colonizing Western powers. So what we had is then, just to go very quickly, in Egypt, okay, we have the rise of al-Banna, okay, who started the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 in response to this aggressive secularization that the Turks under Ataturk accomplished. Remember, the Muslim Brotherhood ultimately led to al-Jihad and Jia, which ultimately formed al-Qaeda, which is directly related to the rise of ISIS.
So the West has been intimately involved in the circumstances, in some cases causally involved in the circumstances that led to the development of these groups. Now, this is not to excuse the groups or to excuse terrorism
not
by any
all.
means, but it's to try and understand
Exactly.
how we got into the state of affairs that we're in.
Precisely. And the other thing, I think the other part of the story is our role in opposing democratic movements, in the Middle East. Okay? Now, Americans tend to forget that in 1953, we overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran.
Mohammad Mossadegh.
Exactly. And we put the Shah of Iran, a dictatorial regime, again, a secularist as well, in his place. We also opposed, rather I should say, we supported the Algerian militaries over canceling elections in 1991, elections the Muslim Brotherhood would almost certainly have won. Last year, we implicitly ratified Egypt's military overthrow of the first fairly and freely elected president of Egypt, a Muslim Brotherhood member. Unpopular, a bad ruler, but nonetheless, we have implicitly ratified that action. The other thing that we implicitly ratified is that the Egyptian government killed about 1,400 Muslim Brotherhood protesters. I mean, this was a direct action to kill these people. It was not an effort to disperse an unruly crowd. So we have to change course, in my view. We have to start moving towards promoting true democracy in these areas, even if they are governments that we don't like, in order to not make it a choice between rather forcing them to essentially forget the ballot box and move to violent actions against us.
We are now in this fight against ISIS in Iraq and also in Syria. But it seems haphazard to an outside observer. What's the goal? What's the end game? And can this fight possibly be won from our perspective and primarily through air power?
Yeah, I think there are some major issues with this. I mean, I think everyone has commented on it. I think, look, let's first admit that ISIS is an extraordinarily brutal organization.
They're a horrible outfit.
It is committing war crimes. I mean, they're killing prisoners, okay? I mean, you may not like the Syrian army, but you don't kill prisoners who are virtually helpless. Okay?
And they're killing civilians.
Killing
men,
civilians,
women,
routinely.
children.
Okay. They're killing Yazidis. They're killing Shia. They're also, not to mention the beheadings, the crucifixions. Okay? kidnapping women. Reports are that these women are being essentially sold to others or given to the combatants.
So there's no defense that can be made.
There's no question that this organization has to be stopped. Agreed. The difficulty is, based on what I just said, is the United States the best? Are we really in position to lead this fight? And I think what we really need in this country is a full debate on this issue before Congress. I have great respect for President Obama on many issues, although I criticize him on counterterrorism policy. But there should have been a congressional debate. There should have been hearings and a congressional debate on this. This may be a war that will last for decades. And it's something that it may endanger the United States. There may be a greater possibility of revenge attacks against the United States.
Of terror attacks within the borders of the U.S. Yeah.
So my view is we needed a full and complete debate in order to make and to assess this. Because as you pointed out, I mean, what is the end game? I mean, it's really unclear as to exactly what victory would look like. And there's the risk that this again is going to give the ISIS the argument that essentially it's the United States against Islamists. Okay? So justifying a holy war against the West. So I think we need to step back, okay? Again, have a full debate on this, okay? Look into every aspect of this before we continue to go forward.
Now, Senator Tim Kaine, a Democrat from Virginia and an ally of President Obama, takes the view that you've just taken, that the president really did not have the authorization to launch these strikes against ISIS, that there should have been a congressional debate and a congressional vote, an authorization from Congress to go to war against ISIS. Why didn't this happen?
From what I understand is that because of the nearness of the elections, that a lot of people felt that this was going to be a disruptive type of action at that time. Nonetheless, I think this is why we pay our members of Congress to make an important decision like this. And I agree with Senator Kaine. If you look at the 2001 authorization for use of force, it's focused on al-Qaeda. I mean, this group has separated from al-Qaeda. I mean, it's amazing if you think of it, that even al-Qaeda believes that this group is too radical.
This group is way worse than al-Qaeda. I mean, it'll give you an idea of what you're dealing with.
Exactly. But the point is, we need an authorization. But more importantly, in my view, that was 13 years ago. Ironically, the Bush-Cheney administration relied on a 13-year-old Security Council resolution to justify its invasion of Iraq. So, so one wonder, well, anyway, the point is that there should be a full debate on this. Okay? The legal basis for the invasion itself from a U.S. constitutional point of view is slender at best, and it would be much better for us as a country and much better for us in terms of making the right decision for us to have had a full debate after every side, every view had been considered.
If you don't get authorization from Congress, well, before that, I thought it was clear in the Constitution that Congress had the authorization, the authority, and the requirement to declare war, that the president, that the executive branch would conduct war, but Congress had to declare war. But it seems like we hardly ever do that.
In practice, we've moved away from it, yes.
So what's happened, and what are the implications? What should the ordinary American take from the fact that we are at war almost all the time now, and yet you never get a declaration of war from Congress? What are the implications of that?
Well, I think the implications are troubling. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Perhaps if there had been a declaration of war, remember, you may recall there was some time span between the time that the Bush-Cheney administration got the authorization to go to war in Iraq and the time that Iraq was actually invaded. One would hope that if there is a routine practice of declarations of war, there would be a fuller debate. The argument is raised that in a case of imminent danger, the president must have the authority to use force to protect the country. And I think there's no question, there's no disagreement about that. On the other hand, here, I mean, had there not been the beheadings of the Americans, would we have taken this action?
I mean, I think it's clear we would not have.
So, I mean, how imminent was it, is my point.
Right.
So I think that this really calls out, because of the risks here, this really calls out for a full debate and a full, at a minimum authorization, if not a declaration of war.
The preferred way of war in the United States right now is the use of armed drones. How should we even begin to look at that kind of war fighting? There has not been any kind of full national debate on that issue either.
The drones appear to be a quick fix. So in other words, and it's very cosmetic. You have someone in a control room in Langley, Virginia, or in Nevada, wherever, and you target an individual and that person is killed. Also, they tend to be more discriminate weapons than, say, gravity bombs, okay? Although they're not as discriminate as some of their advocates, believe them to be.
The advocates would say that these are very precise weapons and that essentially, or for the most part, they only get the bad guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, they are more precise than gravity bombs. There's no question about it. But typically in a drone strike, they fire at least 2 Hellfire missiles. Hellfire missiles can destroy a house. Okay? You fire 2 of them, 1 can destroy a house. 2 of them will almost certainly destroy a house. If anyone's in there who is not an insurgent, then they're going to be killed. But the point that I want to make here is that Musab al-Zarqawi, okay, was subject of a targeted killing by the United States in 2006. You may recall he was the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq is ISIS under a different name.
Right,
okay?
it's a precursor of what we know as
and
ISIS.
we made a big deal about the fact that, yes, we got the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the question is, has that really advanced us? All right? There's Jenna Jordan from the University of Chicago has a study which suggests fairly strongly that so-called taking out of the leadership of a religious terrorist organization is generally counterproductive. Now again, this is one study, there are a few other studies. There's some counter studies. I don't mean to suggest this is gospel. But certainly there is a possibility, and perhaps even a probability, that targeting the leadership of a terrorist organization based on religion that adopts a suicide bombing ethos could very well be counterproductive. And certainly, despite all of the acclaim of the killing of al-Zarqawi in 2006, okay, this organization we're facing now is far more potent, far more powerful. So we have to kind of step back and think that the so-called easy solutions of targeted killing, typically used by drones, although in that case it was not used by drones, may not be the right answer.
As we pursue this war against ISIS, but it's not a full-scale war against ISIS from the perspective of the United States, I don't see how you win this war. So we've been trying to get the so-called moderate opposition groups in Syria on our side to fight ISIS. A couple of points there. One, the idea of moderate groups in warfare. I used to be in the Army. The idea of moderate groups in warfare will send a chill through you. Those are not the ones who generally win. But their main fight is against Assad. Why would they turn their primary focus to ISIS? Because the United States wants them to do that. And in the absence of something like that, and given the tepid response of our so-called allies in the Middle East, how is it possible to win this war?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. Now Lindsey Graham's solution is to send American troops, make the American troops on the ground. I think it's a tough question. And that's why this thing really needed to be much more fully debated. Because, I mean, first of all, you can't really expect them to target ISIS when their enemy is Assad. Now remember, reportedly, Assad has killed 200,000 people. Now, according to the UN, which came out a report earlier this week, 5,500 people have been killed by ISIS. Now, I don't mean to suggest, I mean, the numbers game is always troubling, but from many people in the Middle East point of view, al-Assad is the far more evil force to be reckoned with. So to expect this group Now, there's another thing, by the way, I just want to mention. We're supposed to train this group in Saudi Arabia, okay? Now, Osama bin Laden's first fatwa, 1996, okay, was entitled, okay, essentially going against the American occupation force, okay, in the land of the two holy places. Because
most Americans are unaware of this or have forgotten.
All right, so now granted, we had about 500,000 troops in Saudi Arabia at the time because of the Desert Storm. But here again, I mean, it's like a reprise of what happened earlier. Now we're going to be training troops in Saudi Arabia, which was what prompted Osama bin Laden's first fatwa. I mean, have we not learned that we have to take a different approach here?
The approach that we've been taking, whatever one's opinions have been about them, have kept us in a state of essentially perpetual warfare since 2001. Now the talk coming out of the administration, the military, analysts, and others is that this fight against ISIS could last years more. Is that the new normal? Are we in a state of perpetual war?
Well, Bob, I really hope we're not. I really hope we're not. I fear that we are. Okay? And that's what I fear. And I think you have to look back and say, what went wrong? Okay? And in my view, the invasion of Iraq, it's very hard to make that legal under international law. It was a violation of international law in the view of most commentators.
That's been the cornerstone of the overwhelming majority of our problems since then, including the problems that we've faced in Afghanistan.
Right. So the other thing I think that we have to do is to take a page out of our close ally, Great Britain's playbook. It took them decades, if not centuries, to learn that when you're dealing with rebels, it's better to use law enforcement and imprison them than to kill them or execute them. The 1916 uprising in Great Britain resulted in the death. After summary trials, Great Britain executed all the leadership positions, some 15 members. Sinn Féin, which was essentially the precursor to IRA, was generally unpopular in Ireland. They were considered radicals. They were kind of outside of things. But because of the manner in which they were executed, tried and executed, the Irish people rose up, and you had the Irish Free State 5 years later. Great Britain learned from that experience that the way in which to handle individuals who are rebels is not necessarily to kill them or execute them, but to use law enforcement to the extent possible. And I'm not suggesting that we can use law enforcement against ISIS given the current situation. But our approach has got to be, ultimately, to make armed force the exception and using law enforcement against individuals who threaten us in this way, the general rule.
We have to stop there. I hope you'll come back and we can pursue this further. We need more time. Professor Tom McDonnell, thank you so much. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. The one and only time that the New York Jets went to the Super Bowl, Lyndon Johnson was president, the United States was fighting in Vietnam, and Barack Obama was 7 years old. As a young and obsessed Jets fan, I was deliriously happy when the Jets won that game, beating the then Baltimore Colts 16-7. What I didn't know at the time was that that was it. That was the high point, presumably forever, for this team known as Gangrene. Jet fans everywhere know what I'm talking about. The Jets once fired a coach, Pete Carroll, who had lost his last 5 games, and replaced him with a coach, Rich Kotite, who had lost his last 7. Pete Carroll is now the coach of the Super Bowl champion Seattle Seahawks. Another Jets coach, Lou Holtz, once promised fans that the team would definitely, now this is a quote, move the ball. He then added, "I just hope to God it's forward." Holtz didn't even last a full season. Nothing's changed. The Jets recently traveled to the West Coast where they were drubbed 31-0 by the Chargers of San Diego. Why am I recapping this nearly half-century of pain and anguish for Jets fans? It's because I love kids. And so, a word of wisdom to all you parents out there. Don't let your children grow up to be Jets fans. That's all for now. See you next time.